Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tarek Masoud. I'm a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School, where I hold the Sultan Qaboos bin Saeed of Oman Chair in International Relations, and I'm the director of our Middle East Initiative, and it's my distinct honor today to introduce our guest, Ambassador Ryan Crocker. Now, when our program announced that we'd be hosting Ambassador Crocker this week, one of my colleagues, who's actually a distinguished former public servant in his own right, sent me a congratulatory email saying, and I quote, "Crocker is such a superhero." And even the most cursory glance at Ryan Crocker's resume will explain why. A native of Spokane, Washington, Ambassador Crocker went to college close to home and majored in English literature. But then he embarked on a career that would take him very far from home. He joined the Foreign Service, he learned Arabic, and he quickly established himself as one of the United States government's leading students of and representatives to the Arab and Muslim majority worlds. He served as U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan from 2011 to 2012, and he was the man who actually helped establish our embassy there in 2002. He was our ambassador in Iraq from 07 to 09, our ambassador to Pakistan, to Syria, to Kuwait, and to Lebanon. And in fact, when he was a young Foreign Service officer, he was actually stationed in our embassy in Lebanon during that very tragic year of 1983, when hundreds of Americans and Lebanese were killed in the bombing of our embassy and of the U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut. As you might expect of someone with a career as storied as Ambassador Crocker's, he has been the recipient of many honors and is currently engaged in many worthy causes that would take up too much time for me to list, so I'm going to highlight just two. In 2009, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is our country's highest civilian honor, and I think a fitting tribute to someone who's taken on some of our country's most challenging foreign policy portfolios. And he's currently on the board of advisors of a group called No One Left Behind, which is dedicated to ensuring that America keeps its promises to the Afghans and Iraqis who put their lives at risk to work with American soldiers and diplomats to rebuild their countries, and who now face uncertain, and in the case of Afghans, harrowing futures. I think Ambassador Crocker's involvement in that effort is quite eloquent of his quality as a human. So welcome, Ambassador Crocker. We're really thrilled to have you with us today.
Well, thank you very, very much, Professor, for having me today. These are weighty issues, and no one better to conduct a trip through them than you are. So I'm really honored here. I'll start, if I might, with what you just mentioned concerning No One Left Behind. As the professor said, it's an NGO dedicated to fulfilling our commitments to those in Afghanistan who helped us. The interpreters are the best known group, but really it covered a wide spectrum, and it included those who served us so well at our embassy in Kabul. We cannot run our embassies around the world without a courageous and dedicated staff of Foreign Service nationals. And these people put their lives on the line, literally. But the way it has played out, very sadly, of course, there's an irony now in the name of our organization, No One Left Behind. We left thousands behind. And at a certain level, this becomes deeply personal. Out where I am, Spokane, Eastern Washington State, a strong military tradition. A lot of our young women and men go into the service. Since the fall of Kabul, I get emails from vets who say, "Can you please get my guy out?" And generally, I can't. And it weighs on me because it weighs on them. We've already got a horrifically high rate of suicide among our veterans, our younger veterans, and to hear the kind of the desperation in these pleas just takes it right home into heart. So I thought I'd sketch out just a few themes at varying levels, starting with Afghanistan itself. I did have the privilege of officially opening our mission there after the fall of the Taliban few days after New Year's 2002. So was in that sense present at the creation. It was a scene of utter devastation. It's hard to describe. Whole city blocks of Kabul had been obliterated. Looked like Berlin, 1945. We didn't do that. The Taliban didn't do that. The Soviets didn't do that. By and large, the Afghans did it to themselves in their vicious civil war of the late 1990s. So I got a pretty low benchmark when I look at the Afghanistan I walked into in 2002 and the Afghanistan we walked out of in the month of August of this year. We made a lot of mistakes in our assistance strategies, no question about it. But we also scored some very important successes in areas such as education. Again, beginning of 2002, maybe 900,000 kids in school countrywide. They were all boys. Education being denied by the Taliban to girls. Infant mortality, maternal mortality, and overall life expectancy rates were just about the worst in the world. The Afghanistan we walked out of, maybe 8 million students in schools. 35% at least were girls. Healthcare, that wasn't even a dream for Afghans in 2002, that has significantly lessened the mortality rates I just mentioned. In many respects, these were our least expensive projects because they didn't involve a lot of bricks and mortar. It was societal evolution in full partnership with the Afghans themselves and its then vibrant NGO community. The volunteers, the civil society groups, not only the government. So again, the gains were tangible in spite of all the missteps along the way. These steps, the positive steps, were not an end in themselves, and I just would underscore that as quickly as I can. Much has been written in recent weeks and months on predicated on the assertion that the United States lost its way. It forgot why it was there. It had gone on too long, and we had just become so diffuse in what we thought we were trying to do. I just don't buy any of that. I certainly knew why I was there. I was there to take the first steps to ensure that never again would the American homeland be attacked from Afghan soil. Pretty basic. And it had some punctuation marks, even back then on the 6-month anniversary of 9/11, March 11, 2002. We had a small ceremony at the embassy where we commemorated the emplacement of a piece of the World Trade Center at the base of our flagpole. It had been brought to Afghanistan by the commander of the 5th Army Special Forces Group, and he emplaced them at different places around the country. The message: never forget. Afghanistan, specifically the Al Qaeda under Taliban security cover, brought 9/11 to us. We brought pieces of the World Trade Center back to the other end of ground zero as a way of saying never again. And I do wonder, I have these waking images I'd like to erase of the Taliban walking through our embassy compound, poking sticks at stuff and having a good laugh over this one. We had a rare moment when our national security imperatives and our values coincided in Afghanistan. Educating girls wasn't just a nice thing to do. It was, in my view, a critical means to our goal of our own national security back home. A well-educated population is far more likely to be focusing on broader issues, on building up a better society, bringing prosperity, all of the things that, in a word, you don't associate with the Taliban. And there were cartoons at the time harking back to the weapons of mass destruction that weren't in Iraq. One cartoon I remember in particular, a young woman holding up a book in the face of numerous Taliban-like caricatures, watching them shrink back. And the caption was, "Weapon of mass instruction." The one thing the Taliban did not want to see. We gave that all away, of course, very sadly, and we did give it away. We were not defeated in Afghanistan. We were not facing unsupportable costs. We were not facing Vietnam-style demonstrations. Back home, we were not distracting ourselves from other important things in the globe. We just got tired. We didn't want to do it anymore. And I guess the sad irony of all of that is that we now have a Biden-Trump doctrine on Afghanistan. Inconceivably to me, President Biden bought into President Trump's catastrophic policy of disengage at any cost, get out no matter what. And we will be paying for that for a very long time, I'm afraid. There is an irony within an irony. The first thing we did in Afghanistan was to stand up girls' schools. And we had them up and running in Kabul by mid-January 2002, when I received my first congressional visitor. And that was the then chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, a senator from Delaware named Joe Biden. We went to visit a first grade class. The kids ranged in age from 6 to 12 because the 12-year-olds had been denied their chance at education when the Taliban came. And I remember Chairman Biden came away with the same sense that I had. This is what we need to do. This is how we ensure our own security. Somehow he, I think, lost track of that thought in the intervening years. Let me just move now quickly to the region. We can imagine that in Pakistan, say, there were high fives being exchanged in the corridors of power in Rawalpindi and Islamabad. The Pakistanis had said to us all along, or said to, I was an ambassador there for 3 years, we're all in with you on Al-Qaeda. But on the Taliban, think again. We were strategic allies, again, this is a Pakistani narrative, against the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan throughout the 1990s. The most allied of allies, and it worked. Soviets were forced to retreat. It was the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union itself. But then you left too. You said, our work here is done and we're gone. And then, of course, that horrific civil war that I mentioned earlier, right on Pakistan's borders, that they had to cope with. So when one group emerged from the deserts of the south and showed it might have the legs to carry this conflict to an end, the Pakistanis went with them, the Taliban. We hadn't left them a lot of choice. That not only did we pull out our effort in the area, the training and so forth that we've been doing, we allowed sanctions, broad-ranging sanctions, to be put back into place against Pakistan, prohibiting all economic and security assistance for any country pursuing a nuclear weapons program. They had been public about that since the 1970s, as had the Indians. So again, in the Pakistani narrative, they went from being the most allied of allies to the most sanctioned of adversaries. So they could high-five in that moment of we were right and you were wrong, but only for a moment, because the threat now to Pakistan has increased substantially. The full withdrawal and the manner in which it was conducted has emboldened Islamic militants everywhere. It has certainly emboldened, I think, the Pakistani Taliban, who aim not at the seizure of Kabul, but the seizure of Islamabad, have been emboldened and said so. Kashmiri militant groups that the Pakistanis themselves established at the time of partition to try and wrest that disputed area away from the Indians, and then lost control of those groups. They got a big booster shot from this. And again, throughout the region, look at some of the blogs and the websites. This is a great day for that fanatic fringe who espouse a twisted version of militant Islam. They got a big boost. Now that will have to play out over time, we'll see. But it plays into, again, a perfect storm set of circumstances. The policies of Prime Minister Modi, for example, have embittered and angered the inhabitants of Kashmir, mostly Muslim, Indian Kashmir. So you've got a fertile ground across that line. And we've seen what has happened before with the Mumbai attacks. Well, you can bet that there are guys out there who are getting ready for the next round of Mumbai attacks. You know, box the compass here. China, very short border with Afghanistan, goes back to the days of empire. Their near genocidal campaign against their own Muslim population, I would posit, has done the same thing that the Indians have done to their Muslim population in a disputed area, the Uyghurs. So looking at each other up there, they're going to say, oh man, they've showed us how to do it. The other side, to the west, Iran, you know, again, those 15 minutes of delight that the great Satan got one in the chops. And now they're scared. There just is not enough room, particularly sharing a border between an Islamic emirate and an Islamic republic, one Sunni, the other Shia. And as we have long forgotten, if we ever knew it, in 1999, Iran and the Taliban-controlled Afghanistan nearly went to war. So for the Iranians, this is an existential moment. Broaden it out farther. Again, anywhere you've got the roots of an Islamic militancy, those guys have gotten a big boost. And we will see how it plays. I don't think it's going to play that well. And finally, I would seat this in the broadest context I can. What does it tell us about the international order? What impact did our actions have on the world going forward? Well, I would hark back to 100 years of history. After World War I, we certainly played a military role of significance, but we were not part of the Versailles Peace. The Allies didn't want us, and our own population didn't want us to. What did you get? You got a 20-year truce for between two halves of a horrific world war. That's all it was, 1919, 1939. After World War II, different. I mean, we envisioned the institutions of a post-war world. San Francisco Conference for the United Nations, Bretton Woods for the international financial system in which the dollar replaced the gold standard. And then we led. We didn't dominate. We did not behave like world autocrats. We just led. That started to come unraveled a bit under the Obama administration, frankly. When, for example, he decided that the refugee flows were since World War II. That was a Middle Eastern problem. It was an African problem, a European problem, not an American problem. Well, it became a global problem as the waves of refugees and migrants brought about the deepest divisions in Europe since World War II. Made the Russians quite happy. But it was President Trump, of course, who put all that on steroids, pulling us out of the Iran nuclear deal, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Paris Climate Agreement. That was, a very significant pullback, and I fear that having now talked the talk during his campaign, President Biden, on international re-engagement has sent a catastrophically different message to the world by his decision to pull out all of our forces from Afghanistan. So does this mean America is no longer going to lead in the world? No, the rest of the world is much preoccupied with that and already taken steps. What do you get if you don't have an American ascendancy, if you will, globally, an American involvement globally? Defaults to a balance of power system. And balance of power is perfectly legitimate as long as it stays balanced. That was what we saw in Europe again in the 20th century. When it doesn't stay balanced, maybe you get world wars. And this globally is something we should all be focused on. Secretary Blinken famously said some time ago, the world doesn't run by itself. Well, I think we're about to find out what that means if America stays back, stays disengaged, and lets others step forward. For me, the danger or the risk isn't at all that China is going to replace us. China can't. No one can. I was at one of these track 2 things. This is what old retired diplomats get to do, talking to other old retired diplomats and pretending it actually has some meaning. I was in a conversation with former Chinese colleagues on the Middle East. One former Chinese ambassador that I had seen over the years in different countries, for whom I have great respect, put it that bluntly. We are not going to lead in the Middle East. We simply will not, and we can't. So you guys might want to think twice before you think about completely disengaging, because it isn't going to be us who steps in. God knows what it will be. So on that irrationally optimistic note, I will turn it back to you, Professor, and questions you may have.
Thank you for that, Ambassador Crocker. That really important set of insights, and you've put a lot of issues on the table for us to dig into. And so what I'll do is start by engaging you in some discussion about this, and we're going to try to end at around 2:15, and about a half hour before then we'll open it up to the rest of the audience, who are already, I can see some of them are raising their hands. I will note before we get to audience questions that today's event is being recorded, so it's going to live on the internet forever. So if you in the audience are planning to ask a question of the ambassador, you can do so by raising your hand, and then I'll call on you, and your name and voice and likeness will be memorialized for all time. Or if you'd prefer to render your question anonymously, you can just direct it to me using the chat function. So Ambassador Crocker, I'm going to stipulate at the outset that there's nothing that you've said about Afghanistan that I don't agree with. I really find myself almost entirely persuaded by what you've said, and I also am deeply aware of the gulf in knowledge between the two of us. What you have forgotten about Afghanistan, I have not yet learned. But participants in this series of ours will know that what I like to try to do is steelman the most powerful, potentially opposing arguments that we could envision, and in part to generate discussion and help us get to some potentially deeper truth. So what I would imagine the strongest supporter of what you call the Trump-Biden policy of disengagement on Afghanistan to say would be, look, Ryan Crocker, you said our job in Afghanistan was to ensure, quote, that the American homeland would never again be attacked from Afghan soil. Guess what? We achieved that. 2001 called, and it wants its foreign policy priorities back. Fact of the matter is, U.S. homeland is extremely hardened against attack from the outside. There isn't really much of a plausible scenario by which militants in Afghanistan could coordinate another 9/11-like attack in the United States. And if Al-Qaeda is getting the band back together, as I've heard you say, it's not a band that can play in the big venues anymore. It might play, if I can stretch this analogy or metaphor, might play in the small clubs of the regional backwaters, but that's really not something that we should spend billions of dollars and thousands of lives to avoid. What do you say to that?
Well, first, we're not spending billions of dollars and losing thousands of lives anymore. I'm very aware of the human cost of war. I'm associated with the Gold Star family group out here in the inland Northwest. Sadly, most Americans don't even know what a Gold Star family is anymore. What we had done over the years in Afghanistan was to make the cost quite affordable over the very long term. When I was ambassador, it was the height of the surge. We had over 100,000 U.S. Soldiers and Marines on the ground. After I left, we saw a steady reduction in those numbers, so that by the time President Obama left office in January 2017, we had, I think, 14,000. Yet in that year and a couple of years subsequent to that, the Taliban basically was on its back foot. The Afghan National Security Forces, having taken over the main responsibility for combat in Afghanistan with our critical assistance, was beating up the Taliban pretty bad. Now that, as we cut and cut and cut, the Taliban literally gained some ground, but at the time of the inauguration of President Biden, they could not hold a single provincial capital of the 34 in Afghanistan. So we had a presence that we could afford literally. I don't think the sustainable number was 2,500 or 5,000, something more than that, but probably certainly no more than 10,000. As opposed again to the 110,000 when I was there to do the same kind of job. So it was a great insurance policy, and again, an affordable one. We had not had a combat fatality in 18 months there at the end. So this is not a huge profligate waste of blood and treasure. It was a cold, hard-headed acknowledgement of a basic fact. Don't talk about victory or winning in Afghanistan. We're not going to do that. But we can manage the issue indefinitely. And we chose, again, not to do it. Now, putting the band back together, look, lots of terror groups in a lot of places, they all deserve some pretty close attention, but only one actually prosecuted an attack into the United States. And that was Al-Qaeda combined with the Taliban. It's not theoretical. They did it. The intelligence community assessment is that with our departure and their partial return, that Al-Qaeda will probably be back in the long-range targeting business within 6 months. That should chill any American. I mean, literally chill you. So again, they did it once. Is it inevitable they will do it again? No, not at all. And it is certainly true that our defenses are exponentially greater to prevent such an attack than they were on 9/11. But anyone who has been involved in any sport, say like football, You can't win a game if all you've got is defense. You can't do it. And again, we were managing the offensive end of that in a way that kept our costs and losses to an absolutely minimal level. So that would be my my response on this. Again, we were not looking at mass public protest. I mean, this was not Chicago in 1968. Afghanistan was barely mentioned in the presidential campaigns of 2016 and 2020. So it became an unforced error on our part with some really dire consequences.
What do you think, Ambassador Crocker, drove that decision? If our engagement in Afghanistan wasn't that costly, and as you know, it wasn't really on the public radar screen, was it what? Was it just stupidity on the part of the Trump and then Biden administrations? Was it malfeasance? What drove this decision in your view?
Well, that's a great question. No, it was certainly not stupidity. These are not stupid people, not in either administration. Nor was it malfeasance, although that could be a discussion worth having. It harks back to something broader and deeper that has that I touched on in my earlier comments. We ran out of patience. I call it strategic patience. The political will to stay in a fight and to determine the presence and the mission of the United States in a given area on conditions, not on calendars. That is not, the failure of strategic patience is not unique to Afghanistan. You find it elsewhere where the United States just doesn't want to do hard, costly stuff anymore. In a sense, it's kind of the reverse of the negative side of the very positive quality of impatience that built our great country. Get her done, get on with it. And if you can't, move on to something else. Well, years ago, the Taliban were credited, if that's the right word, with the slogan, well, you Americans may have the watches, but we, the Taliban, we've got the time. And that was, of course, the core of the Pakistani argument for refusing to turn the Afghan Taliban into a mortal enemy. That we had run out of patience. We came back into Pakistan after 9/11, but again, as I heard the narrative, you're going to leave again because that's what you do. You've done it to us once. You'll do it again. You're going to get on your planes and you're going to go away. Well, we can't do that because we actually live here full time. So we are going to be darn sure we have not created an enemy to make you happy with the Afghan Taliban and then live with the consequences of that. So this powerful signal with its horrific images of Afghans, panicked Afghans mobbing a taxiing C-17, and some of them actually riding it to their death when they fell out of the wheel wells after takeoff. Well, that says about all a lot of people will need to hear about the absence of U.S. strategic patience. And I'm not trying to give either President Trump or President Biden a buy on this, but this issue of failing to be ready to stay the course is a huge problem for American diplomacy, and it has just gotten a lot bigger.
So, there's a lot to discuss here, Ambassador Crocker. I mean, again, I'm going to preface this question by saying I actually completely agree with you. But, somebody could, look at your idea of the need for strategic patience, and you've articulated this in a really sharp New York Times editorial this summer. And they could say, look, I don't really understand what this strategic patience thing is. It sounds a lot like the definition of insanity, to kind of keep on doing the same thing and expect a different result. So I guess here's my question. If we have a strategic patience, how do we know if something, an intervention, isn't working and needs to end? What kind of evidence in Afghanistan would have caused you to say, oh, you know what, strategic patience isn't needed anymore, what we need is strategic withdrawal?
That's a fascinating idea, a strategic withdrawal. Well, if that was the aim, they certainly blew that one, didn't they? And look, it's a perfectly valid question. In fact, it's an essential question. How I wish we would have had a national debate on just that point. But in my experience over the years in national security affairs, I mean, it's a tough business. And one of the toughest elements in it is knowing when the assumptions you made to launch a policy and to begin to kick off a strategy. When and how do you know if they've changed? The human temptation is, particularly if you feel you did get it right, is to keep going with it. But what happens if reality has taken a 90-degree turn? And indeed, yes, insanity is defined in some cases as doing the same things with a different result. But we did learn, and we learned on the ground. I mean, we were, I cited the troop numbers. It would not have been desirable or in any way productive to keep 100,000 troops in Afghanistan indefinitely. Well, our military leaders, they figured that out. They figured how they could train up Afghan capabilities to the point that we could hand off increasing sets of mission objectives to them, and there would not be a threat or a reality of a resurgence. Similarly, on development, no more bricks and mortar. God, setting in place the kinds of mechanisms that can reduce, if not eliminate, whole-scale corruption. Concentrate on the social sector as we did in health and education. So strategic patience to me does not mean staying on a blinkered approach that may no longer work. It is adjusting to circumstances and to our own political climate. But that's what makes Afghanistan so hard for me. This not only wasn't too hard to do, we were actually doing it.
You know, that's fascinating. You know, Ambassador, I think our audience would leave today's conversation, you know, concluding that the Trump and Biden administration's lack of strategic patience was, I think, as you said, a function of them getting tired. But they got tired from something that, according to you, wasn't very taxing. That this didn't, in your narrative, require a great exertion from the United States. And that does make it puzzling. And so I want to offer two alternative hypotheses that might explain the decision in Afghanistan, stipulating that I am in agreement with you that it was an error. So the first could be, look, you know, the Trump and Biden administrations actually agreed with you, Ambassador Crocker, that we had been able to get our troops down to such a minimal level, and yet the Taliban were unable to hold any provincial capitals. It was therefore not unreasonable for us to think that, you know, the Afghans can get this. We could withdraw. I mean, if, you know, who would have thought that 2,500 troops or 5,000 troops would have made the difference? That's one hypothesis. And so it would be an error, but it would almost be an understandable error if what you described is correct, which is that the Taliban were on the back foot. The other alternative hypothesis is that the U.S. was looking at this situation and saying, look, certainly the mission that drove us there to Afghanistan in 2001 has more or less been achieved. The idea that the Al-Qaeda could really constitute a threat to us in the homeland is not as worrisome as it once was. And Pakistan, Iran, Russia, all of them have a serious interest in taming the Taliban and in preventing Afghanistan from becoming a place that harbors Al-Qaeda. And so let them deal with it. Let's be very clever, withdraw, get ourselves out from in front of this, and let the Pakistanis, let the Iranians, who you, Ambassador Crocker, told us are very worried about the Taliban's resurgence. Okay, let them deal with it. Why? So the two alternative hypotheses, why are they both wrong?
And again, this is part of a great national debate we never had, to our loss. So trying to figure out which end to start with this. What you're describing up front, your first part of that, was the term you used earlier, strategic withdrawal, kind of a handover. That would have been pretty to think, but that was not the way it was. Again, as we saw so graphically, there was nothing strategic about our withdrawal. Now, what the real factor there is one of those into the weeds things that are a little bit complex, and we'd rather not deal with complexity in international affairs, I know. We had patterned an Afghan army, as I understand it, that was, in terms of its deployability, similar to our own concepts, which meant that relatively small numbers of ground forces, national police or army, would be sent way down range, but would have significant air backup, both for supplies and replenishment, for medevacs, and as necessary close air support against an enemy force on the ground. And that works really great, actually, but it only worked as long as we were there. The Afghans definitely know how to fly combat aircraft, helicopters and fixed wing, but they can't maintain them. It's just, that would be like decades to come. Ours are very complex systems. And the contracts that had our contractors there doing the maintenance on their aircraft stipulated that when our forces go, they go. And they did. And that meant all of that list I just laid out of criticality of air support, that was gone too. Meaning that the whole strategic model for the Afghan National Security Forces, which we designed, was no longer going to be operable. Well, the troops on the ground knew it, the Taliban knew it, and the rush was on. So again, nothing whatsoever strategic about that. Again, in terms of threat to the U.S. and how it could be otherwise managed, I gave you the example or the citation. Intelligence community thinks Al-Qaeda will be back in business with an external capability within 6 months. And are we really going to hand over America's national security to the Russians, the Chinese, the Pakistanis, and the Iranians? That's nuts. That is just completely nuts. Even President Trump, I think, would have been reluctant to introduce that into the national debate. These countries have very different agendas, and let's face it, capabilities. The Chinese could not be clearer. They're not going to step in our place politically anywhere in the greater Middle East, which I include Afghanistan. They're just not going to do it. The Russians cannot do it. Their weakness today is the same weakness at the latter years of the Soviet Union. They're broke. When Putin at one point said he was thinking of sending Russian troops to Venezuela, my response was, great idea. And don't be miserly. Don't just send a battalion, make it a brigade. How about a whole division? Hey, your aircraft carrier will help tow it there. They have not got the resources. And again, they do have the history in Afghanistan that I think would be self-limiting. And again, the Pakistanis, I don't think they have the capabilities, and I don't think they have the vision to run that particular show. And this is a country with nuclear weapons, by the way. If they've got to worry about their own stability inside, and I cannot imagine a greater act of folly. I didn't think I could imagine a greater act of folly than the way this withdrawal was executed, but a greater act it would be to say, oh, and we can certainly count on the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, and the Pakistanis to make everything good.
I certainly agree with you. We couldn't count on them to make everything good, but on the much more limited task of taming the Taliban, you don't think they could handle that?
Well, again, that is not where China is going. Right. Russia isn't going to tame anybody in Afghanistan. Let's be real here. The Iranians have a huge problem, of course, as a predominantly Shia nation confronting a Sunni adversary. Now, the Iranians are good at a longer game, and they did a tremendous amount to keep the so-called Northern Alliance in the field after the Taliban takeover of Kabul. So that the primarily Tajik and Uzbek militias in the Northeast were able to hang on, had a lot of Iranian support. That's the limit of, I think, what Iran can do. And there isn't a Northern Alliance anymore. They had something to start with. There's nothing there now. They know it, and I'm not sure what they're going to do about it. But you do raise an interesting point. Going forward, we have got to do what we should have been doing all along, broad gauge consultations. Now we're starting this with the Pakistanis, and I think that's critical. We can leave our mutual recriminations aside just for a bit and then focus on what's the threat going forward and who can do what. We need to have a similar conversation with the Chinese. With the Russians, I'm not sure there's much to talk about with them, but we certainly would need to talk about their former Soviet republics in Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. And with the Iranians, look, I have a past with the Iranians. I worked with them right after 9/11 through a series of meetings that started in Geneva, New York, with the General Assembly that brought us together, Paris, and ultimately in Kabul, where the lead Iranian negotiator and myself were opening our respective embassies. We coordinated efforts in the Bonn conference to produce the Afghan Interim Authority and Hamid Karzai, labeling Iran as part of the axis of evil in January 2002. That unraveled all of that. And right now we're fixated on restoring the JCPOA. That is the whole separate subject, but I do not think we're positioned to have a strategic dialogue with the Iranians, but we should. We should be. And we have people in this administration who not only know how to do it, they've done it, like Bill Burns, now Director of Central Intelligence. So what this cries out for, in my view, is a multilateral approach that would be led by the United States. We could still do this, should we so choose. And a key starting point would be with our NATO allies. Boy, they thought they were pissed when President Trump cut the number of U.S. forces from 5,000 to 2,500 without telling them. Well, that pales in contrast to their reaction that we're pulling all the way out, and they better line up some aircraft to get their own guys out. Yet, I do not sense in NATO any kind of emotion that says, we're done with you guys. They don't have a lot of alternatives, and they do have Russia. So I think with enough focus, we should be able to begin a multilateral set of conversations on the region and the international community post-Taliban. How do we assess it, and what do we do about it?
So, Ambassador Crocker, I could probably take another hour and a half asking you questions, but I sense that our very patient and intelligent audience is getting restless and want to engage you directly. So I'm just reminding everybody to either render your question to me in the chat if you'd like it to be asked anonymously, or to raise your hand. And the first person I'm going to call on is Jessica Jordan. Go ahead.
Hi, Ambassador Crocker. Thank you so much for being here today and for your service. I spent a summer in Kabul in 2012 at then ISAF headquarters working on a counter-corruption task force, and Afghanistan has never been far from my mind since then. Something I've been trying to unpack is why the US government several years ago now pretty directly undermined the Afghan government that we for so long tried to legitimize and support and equip by directly negotiating with the Taliban. And in light of that, perhaps the way things went on to unravel wasn't too surprising. Was that strategic impatience on our part? I'm just curious your assessment of that decision to engage with the Taliban as we did, and also perhaps what the nature of US Taliban engagement might look like in the future. Thank you.
It's a great point that I was reproaching myself for not having addressed earlier. When President Trump made his decision to negotiate directly with the Taliban at the exclusion of the Afghan government, that, if you will, was the beginning of the end. That had been a Taliban position, as you know, for quite some time. They've said for years they'd be ready to talk to us. They just weren't going to talk to our puppet. So implicitly, by agreeing to those talks or initiating those talks, we delegitimized the Afghan government itself, and of course its security forces. And then the way it played out made it even worse. Of course, the famous agreement between the United States and the Taliban that the Afghan government would release 5,000 Taliban prisoners. I've been in diplomacy a long time. I've never seen anything quite as extreme as that, where we commit another government to something they were a direct party of, holding those prisoners, and force them to do what we had told the Taliban they would do. And the corrosive impact on Afghan security forces, you just have to imagine it. I mean, these were guys who were killing them, and we have just forced their government to release them to go back to killing them. Not exactly a way to sustain the morale and engagement of your security forces. And I would just say here, because thrashing around to find other entities to blame besides himself, President Biden on several occasions impugned those forces, saying that if they don't have the will to fight, why should we? Well, they lost the will to fight when we effectively said, starting in 2019, we're going home. You guys work out whatever you want to work out, but we are leaving. And then the steps that I've described to make it even worse. I was there at a time when once a week, and you may have seen this, I hope you did, about every week, about every Friday, there'd be a short ceremony in the garden there at ISAF headquarters, where the casualties that killed in action of the preceding week would be remembered. Sadly, we almost always had at least some killed in action every week. And an American officer would kick it off by reciting their names, followed by coalition partners if they had had fatalities. The last person up to the mic was always an Afghan officer, and he didn't read names. He just said a number, 117, 133, whatever it was. That many had died in the fight that preceding week. To say that they didn't have the will to fight is frankly contemptible. Why did he do it? Maybe there's a great PhD thesis in there somewhere. In 2017, President Trump gave a pretty good speech, effectively saying our presence in Afghanistan is driven by conditions and not calendars. The second half was on Pakistan, and I would have written a different one. But to take that point on conditions and calendars, I thought was critical. Why did he then reverse himself? That I do not know. And I don't know. I haven't been able to find anybody around him at the time who did know. But I'm even more perplexed as to why President Biden then embraced that policy. I had a call from the NSC the day before he announced it last spring. It had already leaked, but had the call anyway. I had just one question. Is President Biden keeping Ambassador Khalilzad as Afghan envoy? And the answer was yes. And that's all I needed to know. What that meant was that he had totally embraced and taken ownership of President Trump's Afghanistan policy. And I still cannot imagine why he did that.
Could I offer yet another hypothesis that might explain why he did that? And you tell me what you think, Ambassador Crocker. You know, is what we're looking at here really the result of a new model of thinking about America's role in the world? That, you know, if I were to try to inhabit somebody who believes this, and I stipulate that I myself don't believe it, they would say, you know, look, Ambassador Crocker, you represent an older model of American engagement in the world, an America that stands astride the world like a colossus that has its finger in every pie, that's trying to maintain some delicate balance in which we are always at the head of every table. And in fact, these people are very ambivalent about America's role in the world, very ambivalent about American power. These are American policymakers I'm talking about, who look at our engagement in the world and think this looks like colonialism. And so what they'd like is for the United States to get out of these regions, these parts of the world that are, you know, they might not describe with adjectives as florid as those that President Trump uses, but they nonetheless have the same view of them, and let those people chart their own courses, and let us attend to the divisions at home, to the difficulties that we face, to the restorative and justice that needs to happen here for all of the crimes we've committed against ourselves here in the United States. It's just this very different way of looking at America's role in the world that is fundamentally suspicious of American power and consequently wants to withdraw. What do you think of that? Is that potentially an explanation for what we're observing?
Well, again, it's another critical question, and one that should have had a national hearing, you know, to talk about these things. Yes, certainly, I have spoken in favor of an international order that was U.S. designed and U.S. led. Is there another way to go? Tell me about it. Tell me how it works. What is the new world order if it is not U.S. led? Again, this notion that China is going to take our place, you know, that isn't by any means the worst thing that could happen. The worst thing that could happen is that China can't take our place. So tell me how, absent U.S. sustained U.S. leadership, again, not domination. Only in our dreams did we stand astride the world like a colossus, but we knew how to lead the world, both during the Cold War and subsequent to it. Think of George H.W. Bush's international campaign to liberate Kuwait. You know, that included bringing Syrian troops into Saudi Arabia as a backup. I mean, that's U.S. leadership. So if you're tired and you don't want us to do this stuff anymore, and it's a bunch of old white guys making old white guy decisions, yeah, fine. Tell me what is going to keep the world relatively stable and our country secure and prosperous if we're just done leading. And I'm still looking for that answer, or those to advocate for it. And I've seen some awful things along the way. I just would have to mention this. The so-called progressives in our country, particularly progressives with respect to women's security and women's rights, they were virtually silent on this whole thing. You know, the consequences for Afghan females are grim in the extreme. We've already seen the steps that the Taliban's taken. And there will be more to follow, I can promise you. Yet American liberal voices were virtually silent on this. Is that because there is so much dislike of the American military that progressives are unwilling to say that, well, every now and then they do something right, because there's what they stand between the females of Afghanistan and those who would destroy them. Well, we could have had a discussion about that, couldn't we? And it's a lot of blood's under the bridge now. That perhaps when I was talking about mobilizing an international community and consulting with them and so forth, maybe his first step should be right here at home. But guess what? Flash bulletin. President Biden isn't going to do that.
Okay, let me get another question from the audience, and we have a question from Samat Kubba. Go ahead, Samat.
Hello, can you hear me all right? Perfect. Hello, Ambassador. Thank you so much for making the time to speak with us today. I'm Sama. I'm a sophomore at Harvard. I learned so much from this. This is really, really great. I wanted to ask you a little bit about, the future of our relationship with Afghanistan. The Taliban are running the country. What do you think is next in terms of the U.S. position on Afghanistan? Do we recognize the Taliban and further delegitimize the previous Afghan government? Do we provide support? What do we do?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's underscores the importance of looking forward and asking the what now questions rather than the who's responsible for where we are. That debate still needs to be had, and it is being had, but we've got to focus energy looking forward. So in the first instance, we have this looming humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. For 20 previous hard winters, there was no humanitarian crisis, but that's because we were still around. Now we're not. So what do we do? Well, the first thing is to ensure that the right resources are where they need to be to prevent that crisis. And here, I think the United Nations plays a critical role, in particular the World Food Program. They've had a lot of experience doing things similar to this, and I think they have the capabilities. Also, I think it's some reassurance to us that it is one of the few specialized agencies in the UN system that is traditionally led by an American, as it is today. So item one, humanitarian crisis, and how we mitigate that, and how in particular we keep the Taliban from turning it on us. People of my generation would remember that that is exactly what Saddam Hussein did in Iraq on the oil for food program. He was able, with a lot of success, to blame us for its shortfalls. So we've got to be astute politically, but I think that's doable. Of even greater immediacy, of course, is looking after the people we left behind, both our own citizens and green card holders and those involved in the special immigrant visa process, which is onerous in the extreme, taking years to complete the necessary paperwork. We have an obligation to those people that we undertook, and we have got to follow through on it. That will require, obviously, some degree of Taliban inaction, not action, but inaction, just to let these people go. We have just concluded a protecting power arrangement with the Embassy of Qatar to look after our interests in Afghanistan. I think that's going to be very important. On issues like, again, protecting our own people and evacuating them and evacuating those to whom we have an obligation. Qatar bats way above its weight in these matters, and having them as protecting power and a conduit to the Taliban in Kabul, I think can be very important in steps like that. We have moved our remote embassy to Dubai in the United Arab Emirates, where the Taliban offices, of course, are as well. But which Taliban? It's automatic, I think, to look back to the mid-90s, the rise of the Taliban in Kandahar, and then the sweep through the country. That isn't going to tell you very much about the Taliban today. I think a more apt model might be the Iranian Revolution of 1979. In what sense? I don't think the Taliban have sorted out who they are and who is going to lead. You have got the Quetta Pakistan-based old leadership exiled for 20 years. You have the Doha group. There's some overlap clearly, but only some. And then you got the guys on the ground, the field commanders, some of whom are not old enough to even remember 9/11. But they were the ones doing the fighting, while their older brothers were living the good life, at least in Dubai, if not in Quetta. So I would not assume that what you got now is what you're going to have a year from now. I can't give you any predictions. No one could predict, including the Iranians themselves, what direction this rolling revolution might take. But we're going to have to be very watchful to see what twists and turns might be out there in front of us in terms of not how the Taliban runs the country, but who runs the Taliban.
Okay, thank you. We have about 5 minutes remaining. Our next question comes from Dr. David Patel.
Good to see you again, Ambassador Crocker. So I hesitate to ask a question about Iraq, but it seems an apt metaphor to shift the conversation to Iraq from Afghanistan for why things went wrong in Afghanistan. So when you were ambassador in Baghdad, the U.S. was closely allied with Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki and was fighting Muqtada Sadr and his forces. After last month's election, basically Nouri al-Maliki is the closest, he's a leader of the bloc that's going to be closest to Iran, and Muqtada Sadr, some would argue, is de facto aligned with the United States. And so right now there's a debate in Washington about whether or not this December deadline of removal of combat troops should be used to basically disengage fully from the Iraqi political system, or if the US should basically make that alliance with Sadr more direct in some way. And so I'm particularly interested in your opinion on that.
Yeah, it's good to see you again, by the way. It's been a while. Deja vu all over again, isn't it? The full withdrawal we executed at the end of 2011. That ultimately did not go so well. Without our presence and our political weight, Nouri al-Maliki, I think, reverted to his core self, which was to be completely afraid of a military coup. So, and again, paranoids have real enemies sometimes. I could understand his thinking on that as I got to know him during the time I was there, that Iraq has that history. And that's why he was so intent on strengthening the commander-in-chief role. So once we were not there to try to balance out some really bad decisions on military appointments, all he cared about was loyalty. He was not interested in command capability or combat experience or anything else. It was loyalty. And that loyal but horribly led army, of course, collapsed in the face of the Islamic State offensive in 2014. We have an opportunity here, frankly, to see how this plays out. Maliki, I think, like Sadr himself, is more than ambivalent about the Iranians. Before the program, we were chatting a bit about the Charge of the Knights offensive in spring of 2008. That was Maliki, taken on pro-Iranian militias and the Sadrists from Baghdad all the way down to Basra. He didn't tell us he was going to do it because, as he explained later, if I did, you would have tried to stop me. And he was right. But he was also right in Iraqi terms to do what he did, to stand up to these militias. So Maliki will deal with whoever he has to deal with, but he is by no means reflexively pro-Iranian individual. Few Iraqis are, by the way. And Sadr himself, in my view, there's this great leadership opportunity out there for someone to grab hold of, as his father did, Mohammad Sadr, in sort of that Shia populist creed. The Mahroumin, the dispossessed, of which there are millions of Shia in Iraq. Sadr has never been able to do that. I mean, his sadly, assassination works. He was never groomed for leadership. His father, though, and then his two elder brothers were assassinated by Saddam, and that left him. And he's just never been able to get the formula quite right. But I would see Sadr and Maliki, more confidence in Maliki than Sadr, as that Shia element that is distinctly Arab and rooted in Iraq's Arab traditions. That, I think, is a good thing. We'll see how this goes. The election, the disturbing thing about the election was not the outcome. The outcome was kind of interesting, as you know. It was the participation. And you see the same thing in Afghanistan. If people are giving up on the political system, then we all have a bigger problem even than we do right now.
Thanks for that, Ambassador Crocker, and thanks for the great question, David. You know, I do think that, you know, somebody who has a less expansive vision of America's role in the world might take that last sentence that you uttered, which was your expression of dismay at the low degree of faith that Iraqis have in their nascent democratic political system, and might say, look, you know, how is the United States going to be able to solve that problem? And in fact, maybe you've just testified to the Sisyphean nature of this task. And so then maybe the Trump/Biden withdrawals, this view that America should come home, doesn't look so crazy. I will say that, you know, you talked multiple times, Ambassador Crocker, today about the need for a national dialogue about our country's role in the world. And I think that to the extent that that dialogue is happening, that's in no small part due to you. I mean, you have been such a clear voice and a real exponent of the America's moral commitments. And so what I hope, we've come to the end of our time, but what I hope is that we'll be able to engage more with you and have more intellectual traffic with you here at Harvard when this pandemic is over, and we can finally welcome you to join us here in person. So that is a standing invitation I offer to you, sir.
I look forward to it. You're very kind, and I accept. And it is now on public record because everybody heard it. So I look forward to that invitation.
Marvelous. Well, Ambassador Crocker, on behalf of our audience, just please accept my deepest thanks for this discussion. I think all of us learned a great deal today. I want to also thank you, the audience, for coming and for asking such excellent questions of our guest. I want to thank our team at the Middle East Initiative, particularly Mary Fulham, our program coordinator, for putting this event together. And I would court Mary Fulham's wrath if I did not also encourage you all to join us on Thursday, December 16th at 1 p.m. for a talk by Columbia University professor Stephen Biddle on his new book, Non-State Warfare, The Military Methods of Guerrillas, Warlords, and Militias. I suspect that we will take up a few of the themes that Ambassador Crocker spoke about today. But for now, again, I thank all of you, and please join me in thanking Ambassador Ryan Crocker. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
All right.